Hi, welcome to this podcast. It's entitled Caribbean Architecture, the Vernacular, the Colonial and the Modern. And we're going to be looking today at Caribbean architecture in terms of styles or periods in which architecture developed. At the end of the podcast, you should be able to recognize key architectural phases typical of Caribbean architecture, identify vernacular, colonial and modern architectural typologies, and to appreciate the plurality and multiplicity of the varied forms of Caribbean architecture. I'm going to start off by looking at the traditional or the vernacular. And in this slide you can see on the left hand side a very simple primitive type dwelling that represents the earliest type of structure that existed the island of Trinidad, and may well have existed in many other islands. And below, similarly, a reconstruction of that type of architecture that was undertaken much later to try to capture and represent and explore that style and type of architecture. The images on the right show vernacular typologies, types of architecture that have evolved in very particular places. These are taken from a book by a very well-known architect from Guadeloupe called Jacques Berthelot, who travelled the Caribbean in the 80s and tried to establish a typology of form, that is, different vernacular types that characterize the island where those types were situated. On the left there, you can see the typical vernacular Puerto Rican dwelling type, and on the right-hand side, you can see the vernacular dwelling type from Trinidad. Here are two very interesting texts that treat with and deal with traditional or vernacular architecture. John Muir-Lewis, the Trinidadian architect, wrote a very interesting book called The Jupa and provided many illustrations and drawings that describe the evolution of architecture in Trinidad. It's a very useful book to look at and to see the development of style and the development of different ways of working over periods of several hundred years. And on the right-hand side is the cover of a book from Guadeloupe by Jacques Berthelot, the gentleman who produced those typological studies in the previous slide. And this is called Casantier, Jamun Carrete de, means the Caribbean house, the place where I live. And he undertook also a very detailed study of different types or ways of building in the Caribbean that came out of his studies and his explorations, his drawn explorations of the different typologies. So that's a kind of quick overview of traditional or vernacular building types. Now we're going to look at the next period, the next phase or style or typology that's significant to Caribbean architecture, the colonial. As we know, Trinidad and many of the other Caribbean islands were colonized, and that colonization was made most manifest in terms of the architecture, when I say that, most physically manifest in terms of the architectural and the urban form, the form of the cities that was represented and imposed by the colonizers. So these buildings evolved in many ways using some of the materials and techniques that we see in the earlier vernacular or traditional forms, but were formed very much in the style of the European country which had colonized the particular island. So we can see in Trinidad, for example, very strong influences from architecture from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain, from the 17th and 18th centuries, reflected as shown in this picture in Independence Square, what was then known as Marine Square. Also, the placement of the church, the formation of the streets, and the linearity and the formulation of the buildings and offices and houses that constituted the city. And over time, that form developed into a much more solid and permanent type structure. In that previous image, you'll note that the structures were built out of timber, and here we can see masonry structures. And in the bottom right-hand picture, the image of Frederick Street, systems built cast iron structures, all taking place in the middle of the beginning to the middle of the 19th century, when Trinidad was undergoing a very, very rapid rate of development and colonization. So this architecture was an imposition. It was an architecture that dictated the superiority and the dominance of the colonizing power. And it's reflected in different styles, although in a similar form, throughout the Caribbean. So if you visit Santo Domingo, or if you visit Guadeloupe, or if you visit Fort-de-France in Martinique, you'll see the manifestation of this type of architecture using the styles and manners and ways of building that predominated in France at that time, represented in those places. And in Trinidad, as a British colony, the form of the city, the form of the public spaces, the railway station as we see at the top there, and the main street, Frederick Street, that's developed at this point into the 20s or 30s, all followed a very British form of development. A painter, Michel-Jean Casabon, who worked in Trinidad at this time, painted a lot of depictions of colonial architecture and the process of development that took place under colonialism throughout the 19th century. And you can Google him, Michel-Jean Casabon. There are a lot of images of his work online that evoke and are very much live images of what was happening at that time. He paints people, he paints structure, and this image, the view from Laventail Hill, looking west, shows the reclamation of land to the south of Independence Square. You can see that little green cluster to the right of the buildings in the image. That's Marine Square at the time. And to the left of it, the cluster of buildings are the buildings that now exist between South Quay and Marine Square. And to the left, you can see the lighthouse and the land that is being reclaimed at that time as part of the rapid development that Trinidad was undergoing. It's well worth looking at Michel-Jean Casabon's paintings. They are very good illustrations of Trinidad at this time. He wasn't an architect, but he painted the environment, and his paintings reveal a lot about the form and the nature of the landscape that existed at that time. We move to the modern. Many of you might recognize this building, those of you that are familiar with Port of Spain. This is the Queen's Hall building that currently stands at the junction of the Queen's Park Savannah and the avenue that leads into St. Anne's Road. And this is the competition entry, the rendering prepared by the architect Colin Laird for the competition that took place in the 50s. It dates back to the mid-50s. And oddly, and unless you know this, you're probably not going to pick it up, the competition site, the original competition site, was not where the building is currently situated, but in what is now known as Nelson Mandela Park, formerly George V Park, immediately opposite Roxy. And you can see in the background of this image the pavilion, the CIC pavilion, which is adjacent to Serpentine Road at this location. So here we see a very, very modern style of architecture being imported to Trinidad, indicative of the optimism and the vigor and the hope of a new Trinidad, a Trinidad liberated from colonial power and engaged very much in a global culture. And in the slides here, you can see some other examples of that movement and that trend towards modernity, moving a long way away from the traditional forms we saw at the beginning of the podcast. In the top left, we have the Hilton Hotel. On the right, a picture of Frederick Street in the 50s and 60s. In the bottom left, a modern introduction to a park, a pavilion in the park. On the bottom right, some of you may recognize the Magdalena Grand Hotel that was built in the 1990s in Tobago. So all examples of a modern thrust, a way of building in an optimized way, using modern techniques, using the universal modern language of architecture to express forms and accommodate functions commensurate with a new way of living and a new phase of our development, again reflected in the architecture. Just to finish off, to give you something to think about and something to do if you're interested in this and interested in pursuing your research into it more, I prepared an essay which looks at the history and the narratives that have underwritten Caribbean architecture over the last 150 years. It's published by Small Axe, Duke University Press. It's issue number 17. There's also a lovely book called Caribbean Style, another publication by Jacques Berthelot, the gentleman who produced the book Cas-Antier on the different typologies. Then finally a Jupa. I believe there's one in the UWE library, if you have access to that library. Again, an excellent text that you can also purchase if you go to the paper-based bookshop in the Hotel Normandy in Port of Spain. So that's an overview of Caribbean architecture, giving us a glimpse of what's understood by the vernacular, the traditional, what's understood by the colonial, and what's understood by the modern. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.